The veranda of Whitmore Plantation seemed to swallow me whole that evening. Its wide steps and polished columns bathed in the dimming light of a Georgian dusk. I stood at the threshold, my ivory dress heavy and crisp, the folds stiff with anxiety. The shadows stretched long across the manicured lawn. But my eyes were drawn to the quarters beyond, where the enslaved men labored tirelessly. 5 figures moved among the fading light, their forms rigid with routine, their hands sure and skilled even in exhaustion. Storm clouds gathered beyond the horizon, dark and distant, foreshadowing a night I could not yet fully imagine. I swallowed against the weight in my chest, aware of the double life I led, privileged daughter of the Whitmore dynasty, yet a conspirator in secrets the family would never forgive. The guilt pressed down like the humid Georgia air, each breath thick with unspoken fear. I could not, would not, look away. Every swing of the hoe, every measured step of the horse in the distant corral reminded me of what I was about to risk. My pulse matched the distant rumble of thunder, though the sky was still clear enough to see the darkening outline of the mansion behind me. The eldest of the men, Daniel, I had learned, paused for a moment, his broad shoulders catching the last amber light. His face was calm, almost serene, but his eyes held the patience of centuries and a quiet understanding that I could not yet claim. I had met him only in passing, exchanged whispered greetings in hallways and under trees, but in that moment our connection felt profound. I had never been taught to speak to the enslaved as equals, yet here, under the storm's gathering shadow, I felt compelled to do so in thought if not in word. The weight of my family's expectations pressed on me even as I thought of the plan, forming delicate and dangerous as the wings of a hummingbird. My father, Colonel Thaddeus Whitmore, proud, rigid, a man for whom defiance was a crime worse than theft, remained upstairs, unaware that his daughter plotted against him. The irony of my position was almost unbearable. To be complicit in my own liberation alongside those my family considered property, to wield secrecy as both shield and weapon. I clenched the folded paper in my hand, a token of the pact that would soon bind me to the 5 men beyond the fields. I thought of Samuel, whose courage had always been quiet, restrained, and careful. If I were honest with myself, I had depended on him more than I had ever admitted, not merely as a guide in the dangerous labyrinth of plantation life, but as a companion in intellect and courage. His life had been a series of impossibilities. Sold at 12, educated in secret, trained in knowledge forbidden to men of his color, yet tempered by the reality of property and ownership. And still, he moved through the world with a calm authority, a knowledge of both its dangers and its possibilities that I could never possess on my own. The 5 men worked silently, their shadows long across the earth, unbroken by laughter or complaint. I felt the tension tighten, a rope coiling in my stomach, as I considered the gravity of what we would attempt that night. This was no ordinary disobedience, no minor act of defiance. Tonight, we would challenge the very foundations of the world I had grown up within, a world built on ownership, fear, and control. And yet, in the quiet observation of their labor, I saw not slaves, but men, strong, capable, alive, aware of their own worth, their own potential to act even against the impossible. I drew a deep breath, tasting the humid air, heavy with the scent of earth and summer rain. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed, a lonely sound against the murmur of the workmen. My pulse quickened not from fear alone, but anticipation, the knowledge that once night fell, my life and theirs would shift irrevocably. The burden of blood and birthright weighed upon me, but so too did the fierce promise of freedom. Tonight I would step into the shadows beneath the starlight, paper trembling in my hands, heart quick with both dread and hope. The plantation loomed behind me, a monolith of power and tradition, but in the gathering twilight I saw beyond its walls. I saw possibility. I saw courage. I saw the first faint glimmer of a life unbound. The storm might break, the thunder might roar, but I was ready to move. The oaks stretched overhead like sentinels, their gnarled limbs heavy with Spanish moss that swayed in the humid evening air. Every step I took on the soft earth felt amplified in the stillness, a rhythm that seemed to echo through the shadows. I had slipped away from the veranda, from the safety of the mansion and its suffocating expectations, drawn toward a place that felt both forbidden and inevitable. Beneath the moss-draped branches, the world became smaller, intimate, a secret room carved out of time. Daniel was there before I fully realized it. He stood near the roots of a great oak, tall and composed, his broad shoulders relaxed yet alert. Even in the gathering darkness, his calm strength radiated, a quiet contrast to the storm of emotions inside me. The fireflies flickered around us, tiny sparks of life in the dim sepia-tinted world. I almost wanted to reach for them, to hold on to something delicate, transient, and beautiful, the way one clutches hope in desperate times. I slowed as I approached, my fingers tightening around the edge of my dress. The air between us was charged, not with desire but with understanding. He had seen the fear in my eyes, the trembling of my hands, the weight of the family legacy that pressed on my spine. And yet, he did not flinch. There was patience there, a knowledge that what we were about to do required more than courage. It required quiet resolve, timing, and trust. "You shouldn't be out here," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, blending with the sighing of the leaves. I caught the faint scent of the earth after rain, and for a brief moment, I imagined a life far from the walls and rules that had confined me. I wanted to say I didn't care, that nothing could harm me as long as I stood beside them, but my tongue faltered, betraying the anxiety in my chest. The plantation loomed in the background, distant and imposing, a reminder of the invisible chains that governed my every move. My father's house, with its polished steps and glowing windows, seemed like a fortress guarding secrets I had no right to uncover. And yet here in the shadows beneath the oaks, the rules of the world shifted. Here I was not just a daughter of wealth. I was a conspirator, a witness, a participant in a pact that might shatter everything I had ever known. Daniel's gaze held mine, steady and unyielding. I sensed the unspoken questions, the calculations of risk he carried like a second skin. He knew the lives we were about to alter, the consequences of defiance in a world built on obedience. And still he waited, silent and patient, as if time itself had slowed in deference to the weight of the moment. I let my hand brush against his, not for comfort, but as acknowledgement of our alliance. One touch, and the unspoken vow passed between us. That courage could take many forms, that even those considered powerless could wield influence in moments of precision and conviction. I thought of the others, the 5 men who labored in the distant fields, whose loyalty and skill would soon intersect with our secret. Their faces appeared in my mind like flickers of torchlight, solemn, determined, ready for what must come. The wind stirred the moss, carrying the faint rustle of leaves across the soft earth. I shivered, but not entirely from the cool evening air. A sense of inevitability weighed down upon me, yet mingled with a thrill I had never experienced before. Every step I had taken, every careful deception I had practiced within the mansion walls, had led to this moment beneath the sentinel oaks. And in that suspended twilight, I realized that fear and courage were not opposites. They were companions, inseparable in the pursuit of freedom. "I trust you," I said finally, my voice low, almost swallowed by the moss-laden branches. Daniel nodded once, sharply, as if to seal our pact. No words of reassurance were needed. He understood the stakes, understood that we were not merely walking through shadows, but shaping the very destiny of those bound by chains. Fireflies danced between us, their light faint and ethereal, casting fleeting shadows across the soil. The plantation house, once a looming fortress, seemed distant now, a silent observer to our quiet defiance. I took a deep breath, feeling the pulse of the night, the anticipation of plans that could not fail. For a fleeting instant, the air seemed to hold its breath with me, and as I turned my gaze toward the distant mansion, I understood that the night had only just begun. Beneath the oaks, the first whispers of rebellion stirred, delicate and potent, carrying with them the promise of what we might achieve when courage met opportunity. And in that whisper, I felt the impossible begin to take shape. Night had draped its velvet cloak over the plantation, swallowing the fields and cottages in a quiet darkness that felt both protective and perilous. I moved with careful steps behind the stables, my heart drumming in my chest louder than the crickets or the soft scuffle of hooves in the barn. The air was thick with the scent of hay, damp earth, and anticipation. Every shadow seemed alive, flickering with possibilities both terrifying and liberating. The lantern's glow appeared first, warm and wavering, held by Daniel. Around him stood the 5 men I had come to know, not merely as workers or servants, but as comrades in secrecy. Their faces were solemn, set with a resolve that mirrored the storm of my own emotions. There was no bravado in their stance, only unity. I stepped closer, feeling the chill of night and the heat of urgency mingling in my veins. In my trembling hands I held the folded paper. It was more than ink on parchment. It was a covenant, a map of risk and hope written in letters that could condemn or save us. My father must never know, never even suspect the depth of the plan that had begun to form beneath the oaks earlier that evening. I felt the weight of centuries pressing down, the bloodline of privilege, the chains of inheritance, and the silent suffering of those who labored in our fields. The men watched me, patient, respectful. Each one bore a story etched in muscle and quiet suffering, their eyes reflecting hardships I could scarcely imagine. Yet in that lantern light, they were more than their chains. They were strategists, allies, and architects of a rebellion that demanded precision. Daniel stepped forward slightly, his gaze locking with mine. In his expression, I found clarity. It was not just courage we shared, but a vision of justice long denied. I unfolded the paper and let the lantern illuminate its content. Maps, sketches of the estate, and notes in my careful hand detailed steps that must be taken, routes to avoid, and timing that could not fail. The men leaned in, nodding silently, their faces a mixture of trust and calculated determination. There was no laughter, no hesitation, only the gravity of what we were about to commit ourselves to. A soft mist crept along the ground, curling around our boots and rising in ghostly tendrils. The darkness beyond the lantern's circle seemed to hold its breath. I swallowed, forcing my fear into the recesses of my mind where it could not undermine the task at hand. One misstep, one whispered warning to the wrong person, could unravel everything. And yet, standing there, enveloped in the hush of night, I felt an unexpected surge of resolve. We were no longer pawns in a story written by cruelty and inheritance. We were active participants in a fate we chose to craft with our own hands. The 5 men exchanged glances, subtle shifts of understanding and coordination that spoke louder than words. I had learned to read these signals, to recognize the silent language of shared hardship and mutual respect. Each nod, each glance, fortified my conviction. This was not simply a plan of rebellion. It was a pact of trust, forged in the quiet desperation of those who knew the cost of compliance all too well. I held the paper to my chest, letting it anchor me in the gravity of the moment. My pulse slowed, though only marginally, as I realized the enormity of what we had agreed upon. Tonight was the first step, but it was also a promise to honor the sacrifices of those who had endured long before we had the courage to speak. I looked at Daniel once more, his profile framed by the lantern light, and knew that we were aligned in purpose, bonded by more than circumstance. The mist thickened, swirling around our legs like a protective veil. I folded the paper back into its small rectangle, the inked letters still warm from my touch, as if carrying the very heartbeat of our resolve. One by one, the men acknowledged the pact, the silent oath that we would move with care, patience, and unwavering courage. In the shadows of the stables, a quiet energy settled over us, a current of possibility, danger, and shared determination. For the first time, I felt not just fear or guilt, but empowerment. The night seemed to lean closer, aware of our resolve, bearing witness to the silent covenant that would change everything. In that lantern-lit circle, we were equal participants in a story of rebellion, courage, and the pursuit of freedom. And as I stepped back, allowing them space to discuss the details in hushed whispers, I understood that our lives were now intertwined irrevocably. The pact was made, sealed by trust and necessity, and the shadows of the stables carried the first real pulse of a storm that was about to break. Tonight, beneath the watchful stars and the muted sigh of the land, we had begun to rewrite destiny. The day after our clandestine meeting, the air in the mansion felt thicker, heavier. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the shutters seemed magnified, like the house itself was aware of the secret we carried. I walked through the grand hallway with measured steps, my hands folded delicately before me, my gaze fixed on the patterned rug beneath my feet. The folded paper still rested hidden in the sleeve of my gown, a weight both tangible and symbolic pressing against my chest. I did not expect him to notice. My father rarely looked beyond appearances, but the moment I stepped into the study, I realized he had. There he was, standing rigidly at the top of the staircase, his posture a coiled spring of authority and suspicion. His eyes, sharp and calculating, followed my every movement, narrowing slightly as though he could sense the paper hidden from view. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows behind him cast him in a halo of dominance, the shadows of the room slicing across his face in a cruel chiaroscuro that mirrored the power he wielded over every corner of the estate. I paused, hesitant, heart hammering in my chest. The weight of generations bore down upon me, the expectation to obey, to submit, to preserve the family name at any cost. Yet I could not betray what had begun to stir in the shadows of the stables, the promise etched in ink that demanded courage beyond etiquette or fear. I forced my gaze to meet his, masking the tumult inside with the veneer of a dutiful daughter. "Lydia," he said, his voice low, controlled, yet edged with something dangerous. Anticipation, perhaps, of the fault he suspected, but could not yet name. "Have you been wandering the estate at night again?" I shook my head slightly, careful to maintain composure. "No, father. I sighed the your words faltered, the paper in my sleeve suddenly seeming impossibly heavy. I could feel the silent presence of the 5 men behind the walls, their resolve echoing in the chambers of my heart, urging me not to falter." He descended the staircase with deliberate steps, each one punctuating the rhythm of control and intimidation. The lamplight flickered across his face, illuminating the fine lines of age and authority, the stern jaw, the eyes that had once looked at me with pride, but now seemed to pierce through pretense, seeking betrayal. My throat tightened. I could not let him see the breadth of fear and defiance battling within me. "You know," he continued, his gaze narrowing, "this estate runs on order, on loyalty, and on obedience. Any deviation, any whisper of disobedience, it has consequences, Lydia, severe consequences." I swallowed hard, holding the paper tighter, though he could not see it. I wanted to speak, to assert something of myself, but the words would have been foolish, dangerous. Instead, I lowered my eyes briefly, a show of humility that masked the turmoil of my mind. The very air seemed to vibrate with the tension between us. The history of power and privilege against the quiet, unyielding strength of those who had long endured and waited for this moment. He reached the last step and stopped, looming over me with the weight of authority that had defined my life. I felt small, fragile, yet inside, a fire I had never known flickered. The paper burned in my sleeve, a silent promise of the rebellion we had begun to weave in the shadows. "I expect honesty, Lydia," he said finally, his voice softer but more dangerous, like the calm before a storm. "I have eyes everywhere. Be mindful of what you conceal." I nodded, hiding the tremor of fear that threatened to betray me. His eyes lingered on mine a moment longer, sharp and piercing, before he turned, ascending the staircase once more with deliberate grace, leaving me in the quiet gloom of the room. The lamplight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance in quiet mockery of the weight I carried. As the door closed behind him, I allowed myself a quiet exhale, relief mingled with dread. The moment had passed, but the tension remained, stretching taut like a cord ready to snap. The paper in my sleeve was more than a secret. It was a lifeline, a silent beacon of the pact we had forged, and of the reckoning yet to come. I pressed my hand over it, feeling the contours of the folded edges, and promised myself that no gaze, no fear, no measure of control could break the resolve I had discovered in the shadows. The night was coming, and with it, the storm we had planned, and nothing, not even the master's eyes, would stay its course. The morning air in the kitchen was heavy with the scent of roasting meat and the faint tang of melted butter, but beneath it all lingered something far more insidious: gossip. I moved quietly between the copper pots and wooden counters, careful not to disturb the servants at work. Their eyes flicked nervously toward me, laden with the unspoken knowledge that words spoken in hushed tones could carry consequences heavier than any chains. The moment I reached the corner near the hearth, I caught them, the white guests lingering near the window, voices hushed but sharp, like the edge of a knife hidden beneath a velvet glove. They whispered of betrayal, of secrets too dangerous to name aloud. My fingers clenched the fabric of my dress, the folded paper still secure against my chest. Every syllable that reached me was like a spark to dry tinder, threatening to ignite the delicate web of plans we had so carefully spun in the shadows. From the corner of my eye, I saw the subtle exchanges among the enslaved servants. Their glances were wary yet knowing, a silent communication that I had come to understand in the quiet spaces of the plantation. Daniel's calm strength, always a beacon in the darkest moments, seemed to flow through them, anchoring them even as the whispers sought to unravel our resolve. They waited, patient, careful, like soldiers poised for the signal that would set the events of the night into motion. A flicker of candlelight danced across the walls, illuminating the fine cracks and imperfections of the kitchen, casting shadows that moved like specters of fear. I felt the weight of the house upon me, the watchful eyes of the master and his guests, pressing into my back, even as I stood hidden among the mundane tasks of the morning. Every whisper, every glance, every footstep on the polished floors above seemed amplified, carrying with it the tension that had been building since the first secret meeting behind the stables. I moved closer to the window, pretending to adjust a pot while straining to hear the snippets of conversation that slipped like silk through the room. "She is too soft, too easily swayed," one voice murmured. "I fear for the estate if she cannot maintain loyalty." Another replied, "There are rumors, whispers of secrets in the stables, something the servants would never speak of, Unless compelled, my stomach clenched, my heart thudding like a drumbeat of warning. They were close, closer than I'd imagined, but they did not yet know the full truth. The servants around me exchanged tense glances, their subtle nods affirming what I already sensed. The web of understanding stretched quietly through the room. We were all bound by the same desire for justice, for freedom, for retribution that would shake the foundations of this household. The whispers of the guests, intended to intimidate, instead reinforced the urgency of our pact, the necessity of our resolve. I clutched my dress tighter, imagining the night ahead. Outside, the sun climbed higher, glinting off the windows and gilded fixtures. But the shadows inside the kitchen seemed to grow heavier, pressing against my shoulders. I knew that each day, each moment spent under the master's scrutiny, was another test of our patience, another measure of the courage we needed to survive the coming storm. The guests' conversation shifted slightly, their tones softening, but the undercurrent of suspicion remained, a subtle threat woven into the fabric of polite society. They would speak in riddles, hinting at betrayal without naming it. And yet I could feel their gaze, sharp, probing, like the tip of a spear searching for the pulse of our secret. I allowed myself a slow breath, steadying the tremor in my hand. The folded paper remained close, its promise a silent anchor against the rising tide of fear. The kitchen, filled with the ordinary sounds of cooking and preparation, seemed transformed into a battlefield of quiet tension, where every glance and every whispered word carried weight far beyond its appearance. As I moved away from the window, I glanced once more at the servants, their faces etched with the same determination I had come to recognize in Daniel. We were united in our silent resolve, bound together by the knowledge that the whispers would not break us. Instead, they were a prelude, a reminder of the moment when patience and careful planning would culminate in the night of reckoning. The candle flickered once more, casting elongated shadows across the kitchen floor. In that brief dance of light and dark, I felt the weight of what was to come, and the certainty that we would endure, that we would rise, and that the whispers of the mansion would ultimately herald our triumph rather than our ruin. The sky had begun to darken, heavy clouds rolling across the horizon like a warning from some unseen hand. From my window, I watched the plantation fields stretch into the distance, the rows of crops bending beneath the first gusts of wind. There was a tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as though the world itself were holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Down by the barn, the 5 men, Daniel, Thomas, Elijah, Samuel, and Josiah, stood silently, their faces etched with solemn determination. I could see them clearly despite the fading light. The lantern they held flickered in the wind, casting long, wavering shadows across the ground. Each man exuded a quiet strength, an unshakable resolve that both comforted and frightened me. They were ready. I could feel it in the set of their shoulders, in the way they exchanged knowing glances without speaking. Inside the house, I stood by the window, my hands pressed to the cool glass, heart pounding against my chest. The wind stirred the curtains, brushing my face like a cold whisper. The candle on the sill flickered, mirroring the storm gathering outside, its flame bending and stretching in rhythm with the restless sky. Every detail of the plantation seemed sharper, more defined, as if the approaching tempest had awakened something hidden in the very walls themselves. I thought of the night ahead, of the pact we had made in secret, the folded paper that had bound us together, and the courage it demanded. Tonight, all the careful planning, the whispered strategies, and the silent sacrifices would either bring justice or crush us beneath the weight of failure. The men had waited patiently, enduring years of oppression, and I had endured alongside them, carrying a different kind of burden. But our shared resolve was stronger than any storm. Thunder rumbled low in the distance, rolling across the fields like the growl of some ancient, vengeful spirit. The clouds darkened further, and rain began to scatter in fine drops across the earth, glinting in the last fading rays of light. I could see the wind tugging at the edges of the barn, stirring the dust, lifting the loose planks in small, threatening shudders. And yet the men remained steady, a human barrier of strength and determination against the brewing chaos. My thoughts drifted to Daniel. He had been calm throughout everything, the anchor among the 5, his eyes always calculating, always steady. Even as the wind tore at the lantern, threatening to snuff it out, he held it aloft, unwavering. His gaze met mine through the rain-streaked glass, a silent affirmation. The world outside might rage, the master might watch, and the heavens themselves might open in fury. But we would act, and we would endure. The wind howled louder, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and freshly turned soil. Leaves and small branches danced across the fields, whipped into motion by the approaching storm. I felt a shiver run down my spine, not entirely from the cold. There was a charged energy in the air, electric and intoxicating, as if the plantation itself recognized the shifting balance of power. I knew deep in my bones that the night of reckoning was almost upon us. I stepped back from the window, my pulse racing. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, the tension coiling tighter with each passing minute. I could hear the faint creak of the house settling, the soft patter of rain against the roof, and in my mind, the echo of what was to come. The silent march of men toward justice, the culmination of years of suffering, and the moment when fear and courage would collide. In that fleeting twilight, the world held its breath. The men by the barn, steadfast and unyielding, were ready to take the first step. I, behind my window, felt the weight of my own choice, the knowledge that I would witness history unfold beneath the gathering storm. Tonight, everything would change, forever. The lantern flickered one final time before the wind snatched it, and in that moment I felt it. The storm was no longer just in the sky. It had come for us, and we were ready to meet it head-on. The study was heavy with the scent of old paper and whiskey, the faint glow of lamplight casting long, trembling shadows across the polished wood. I stood near the door, trembling yet determined, facing my father as he sat behind his massive desk. Every muscle in my body was tense, every breath caught between fear and defiance. He slammed his fist down on the desk, rattling ledgers and scattering papers across the floor. "Do you think you can defy me? Do you think your petty tricks will undo everything I've built?" His voice was sharp, resonant with fury, echoing through the small room. The lightning outside flashed against the window panes, illuminating his scowling face in stark relief. In that brief glare, I saw every expectation, every rigid belief, every cruel lesson he had imposed on me since childhood. I clutched the folds of my dress, my knuckles white. The letter, the pact, the truth, the secret of what was to come, was hidden within my hand, pressed against my chest. I knew that showing it now would ignite the confrontation, but hiding it felt like suffocating under his gaze. Every word he spoke struck like a hammer, but beneath it all, I felt a fragile, unyielding strength stirring inside me. "You will never understand," I whispered, barely audible over the storm, but loud enough to carry the weight of my defiance. "You will never understand the lives you've crushed, the fear you've spread, the darkness you've sown." His eyes widened, shock mingling with anger. "How dare you speak to me like that?" He rose from his chair, every motion deliberate, every step heavy on the floorboards. The desk became a barrier between us, yet it felt inadequate to shield me from the force of his presence. The lamplight flickered violently as a gust of wind rattled the windows, as if the house itself recoiled from the confrontation. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the room in a stark, ghostly white. In that instant, I felt the weight of generations pressing down, the legacy of cruelty, the chains of expectation, the suffocating control of a man who believed his word was law. Yet for the first time, I did not feel small. I did not feel helpless. I felt the pulse of inevitability, the current of change flowing through me. "You cannot control everything," I said, voice steadier now, carrying across the distance between us. "You cannot own what you think is yours. You cannot break the lives you have enslaved without consequence." He laughed then, a hollow, bitter sound, but it was laced with fear. "Consequence? You are nothing without me." His fingers gripped the edges of the desk so tightly that the wood groaned under the strain. But I could see it, the cracks forming in his composure, the fleeting doubt behind his fury. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to hold its breath along with us. The lightning faded into distant tremors, the thunder rolling like a warning. I stepped closer, every motion deliberate, carrying the weight of truth in my eyes. "You have underestimated us," I said, letting the words hang like smoke between us. "And soon, you will see the strength you thought was yours was never yours at all." He recoiled slightly, a flash of uncertainty breaking through his anger. In that instant, I understood. This was the breaking point, not just for him, but for me, for the men who waited silently in the dark, for the promise of justice that had been whispered beneath the oaks, forged in the shadows. The wind howled through the cracked windows, carrying the scent of rain and earth, the faint prelude of the chaos to come. Papers fluttered to the ground like fallen leaves, the lamplight flickering as if caught between two worlds, the one of control and dominance, and the one of defiance and liberation. I stood my ground, trembling only from the storm in my chest, knowing that this confrontation was the fulcrum upon which everything would turn. The past could no longer bind us, the fear could no longer silence us, and the night ahead would bring its reckoning. My father's eyes, once sharp and commanding, now held a fleeting shadow of doubt, a recognition that the world had shifted under his feet. In that charged, suffocating room, I understood that the breaking point had arrived, not in violence, not yet, but in the undeniable assertion that the lives he had sought to control would no longer bend beneath his will. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, and I knew with every heartbeat that there was no turning back. The confrontation was only the beginning. A real reckoning waited in the shadows, just beyond the walls of the study, where men and courage and destiny converged beneath the gathering storm. The night had settled over the plantation like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every sound seemed amplified. The whisper of the wind through the trees, the faint flicker of lanterns in the cabins below, the distant croak of frogs in the swampy fields beyond. I stood barefoot on the balcony, my hands gripping the wooden railing, my eyes fixed on the dimly glowing cabins where the 5 men waited. Their silhouettes moved silently, purposeful, shadows dancing across the flickering lantern light. The moon barely pierced the thick clouds, leaving the world in a deep sepia shadow. I could feel the tension in my chest, each heartbeat a drum warning of what was to come. The wind tugged at my dress and ruffled my hair, and I shivered, not from cold, but from the knowledge that the night I had feared and plotted for had arrived. The quiet before the storm was more terrifying than any storm itself. I traced the edge of the balcony with trembling fingers, remembering every whispered word beneath the oaks, every secret plan discussed in the shadow of the stables. The pact we had made, the promises exchanged, they all led to this moment. And yet, as I watched the men moving below, I felt a surge of hope and fear mingling in equal measure. The distant hoot of an owl cut through the silence, and I realized how alone we were. Just 5 men and a woman against the weight of a dynasty built on fear and cruelty. My chest tightened, and I pressed my hand against it, steadying my racing thoughts. The cabins, the shadows, the faint glow of lanterns, they all seemed suspended in time, waiting for the spark that would set everything in motion. I recalled my father's eyes earlier, filled with a rare doubt, a flicker of fear I had never seen before. That glance had been enough to remind me of the power we now held. But fear lingered, wrapping itself around my resolve like a cold chain. Every step we were about to take was irreversible. Once the first move was made, there would be no turning back, no retreat. The air smelled of damp earth and distant smoke from the lanterns, carrying with it the scent of inevitability. I imagined the men below, their faces solemn, each one a pillar of strength amidst the looming chaos. I had learned to read their eyes. The quiet confidence, the disciplined patience, the unity that had been forged in the darkest nights of servitude. Tonight that unity would be tested against the full force of our oppressors. I leaned forward slightly, letting the wind lift my hair across my face, obscuring my vision but sharpening my other sense. The plantation seemed to hold its breath along with me. The grand mansion behind me, silent and imposing, the trees around the balcony whispering secrets, the sky above heavy with clouds and anticipation. It was a night suspended between dread and destiny. I thought of the consequences, the lives that would never be the same, the irreversible marks of the choices we were about to make. Yet in that silence, there was a clarity I had never known. The fear that had once bound me, that had chained my thoughts and dictated my actions, was replaced by a steely resolve. This night was ours to define, and no fear, no doubt, could take that from us. A lantern flickered faintly in one of the cabins, and I held my breath, feeling the quiet electricity of expectation. The world seemed paused, a tableau of suspense painted in sepia shadow. I could almost hear the heartbeat of the plantation itself, slow and deliberate, as if waiting for the inevitable crack that would shatter the calm. And in that moment, I realized that the stillness, the calm, was more powerful than any storm. It was a pause pregnant with consequence, a silence that held within it the potential for justice, for reckoning, for freedom. I could almost taste it in the air, tangy and sharp, promising the night would soon be ours, and with it a world irrevocably changed. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the wind carry my thoughts to the men below. Together we would step into the darkness, and though the world might not forgive us, we would no longer live in the shadows of fear. Tonight, the plantation would witness the quiet before the fire, the calm that precedes revolution, the silence that speaks louder than any words. The night was ours, if only for a fleeting moment, and I would savor every second before the storm broke. The sound of the storm outside was growing, rain pattering against the roof, wind rattling the shutters, but nothing matched the tension building inside the mansion. I had been waiting frozen in the hallway for the moment I had both dreaded and longed for, my hands pressed to my chest, my breath shallow, as I watched the shadows stretch across the walls, cast by the flickering candlelight. Each movement outside felt magnified, each sound loaded with significance. Then it happened. The front door burst open with a thunderous crash, slamming against the wall and shaking the old hinges. Lightning illuminated the doorway, casting sharp angular shadows that seemed to slice through the gloom. 5 men stood there, tall and solemn, drenched from the rain, their faces grim yet resolute. I recognized them immediately. The men who had planned, waited, and endured alongside me. Daniel, Marcus, Samuel, Elijah, and Thomas. They carried nothing but the weight of their purpose, and it radiated from them like a storm about to break. I clutched my mouth to stifle a gasp, heart hammering, fear and hope warring in equal measure. This was the moment we had been preparing for, the night where justice, long denied, would finally arrive. I could feel it in the air, thick and electric, as the men's shadows merged with the flickers of lightning across the wall. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching, heavy with the promise of reckoning. As they stepped inside, their movements deliberate and silent, I saw the way my father froze at the foot of the staircase. His eyes widened, and for the first time, fear flickered across his features. It was a brief human moment of vulnerability, from a man who had ruled this plantation with cold authority for decades. But there was no turning back now. The men had crossed the threshold, and the chain of oppression, invisible for so long, was beginning to fracture. I wanted to run to them, to hold on to their strength, but I remained where I was, a silent witness to the confrontation. My heart ached with the weight of the choices that had led us here, the secrets shared beneath the oaks, the whispered meetings behind the stables, the careful planning that had gone into every step of this night. And yet, despite the fear, there was a clarity, a righteousness in what was unfolding. My father's voice trembled as he shouted, a mix of anger and disbelief. But the men did not flinch. They stood their ground, eyes unwavering, torches in hand, reflections of the stormlight catching their determined expressions. It was a tableau of moral inevitability. The oppressed no longer hidden, no longer silent, stepping into the light to claim the justice they had long been denied. Lightning illuminated the room again, casting brief clarity over my father's trembling hands and the shadows of the 5 men. I could see every line of their faces, etched with endurance and resolve, each scar and mark telling a story of years of suffering. And yet, despite everything, there was no cruelty in their eyes now, only purpose. They had suffered, but they would not become what they had endured. They had chosen the path of justice, not vengeance, even if the world might never see it that way. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the storm outside echo the storm inside me. The mansion's grand staircase, the portraits on the walls, even the chandeliers swaying in the wind, all seemed suspended in a moment of historical inevitability. The room itself held its breath, as though waiting to witness the collapse of an old order. When I opened my eyes again, the men had advanced further, their presence commanding yet calm. I felt a sense of release wash over me. A tension I hadn't realized had been coiled so tightly within my chest. This was justice, not the spectacle of cruelty, but the quiet, deliberate assertion of right over wrong. It was long overdue, and yet in that hallway it was finally here. I looked at each man, then at my father, and realized that the future would no longer be dictated by fear. The balance of power had shifted, even if only by a small margin tonight. The storm outside raged on, but inside there was clarity, there was resolution, and above all there was hope. For the first time in my life I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The men's shadows loomed large, not threateningly, but as a reminder that the world could be reshaped by courage, unity, and quiet determination. Tonight, justice had arrived, and it was as unstoppable as the storm. The air was thick with rain, and the scent of wet earth, as the confrontation in the grand staircase reached its most critical point. My father's face was a twisted mask of disbelief, fury, and desperation. He stood rigid, fists clenched, glaring at the 5 men who now filled the foyer with a quiet, unstoppable authority. I watched from the landing above, kneeling as the shadows and flickers of lightning played across the scene, the wet torches in their hands casting long dancing silhouettes. I could feel my heart pounding, not from fear alone, but from the gravity of the moment. The pact we had forged in whispered secrecy, in the dark behind the stables, had led to this. That small folded paper I had once held trembling in my hands had become something far greater, a symbol of moral justice, a declaration that our lives were no longer defined by the tyranny of fear. The men stood solemnly, torches dim against the rain, each one exuding a calm that contrasted sharply with my father's frantic energy. He barked orders, threatening words, promises of punishment, but they did not flinch. Their gaze was unwavering, and in that steadfastness, I saw the embodiment of years of endurance, patience, and resilience. My father, despite his wealth and authority, was powerless against the quiet collective strength of those he had oppressed. For the first time, the imbalance of power that had governed this household for decades was broken. I lowered myself further on the staircase, tears blending with soot and rain that had tracked in on the men's boots. My father's voice rose again, desperate and threatening, but there was nothing left that could sway the resolve in the room. The men had chosen a path defined not by vengeance, but by righteousness, by the need to assert their humanity and demand recognition for the years of suffering inflicted upon them. Lightning flashed, illuminating the shattered windows and casting stark reflections on the polished wooden floors. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and dominance, now felt fragile, suspended in the storm. Each flash highlighted the lines of determination in the men's faces, the solemn weight they carried, and the tears on mine that mingled with the grime of the night. History itself seemed to pause, acknowledging the significance of this act, this moment of moral reckoning. I thought of all that had led us here. The whispered meetings, the pacts made in secrecy, the long nights of plotting, waiting, and enduring. Every choice, every risk, had been necessary to reach this pivotal moment. And now, standing in the middle of the foyer, with my father's angry cries echoing against the walls, I realized that the pact we had forged was more than words. It was a testament to our resilience, our unity, and our unyielding pursuit of justice. No violence needed to be shown for its weight to be felt. The room trembled with significance. The storm outside, the shattered windows, the quiet strength of 5 men standing against decades of oppression. I had never felt such a potent mix of fear, awe, and relief. This was the culmination of all our planning, all our whispered courage, and all the hope we had dared to nurture in the shadow. As the rain continued to lash against the roof and lightning illuminated the room in violent bursts, I knelt there, letting my presence in the moment anchor the unfolding truth. The pact had been realized. My father could threaten, shout, and plead, but he could not undo what had been set in motion. The men, and through them I, had claimed the moral victory we had long sought. It was a quiet but absolute assertion of justice, a declaration that power could no longer be wielded unchecked, that the bonds of fear and subjugation could be dissolved without a single act of revenge. The torches flickered, shadows danced on the walls, and I knew deep in my bones that the balance had shifted irrevocably. In that moment, drenched in rain, trembling from the storm and the intensity of the confrontation, I felt the first real taste of freedom. Not just for myself, but for the men who had risked everything, and for the generations to come who would no longer live in the shadow of tyranny. The pact was not just ink on paper. It was a living testament, a moral reckoning, and a promise kept. And as the storm raged outside, the mansion trembling with each flash of lightning, I understood. Nothing could erase this night, this act of courage, and the solemn, resolute faces of the men who had brought justice home. Dawn broke with a heavy sky, streaked with smoke and the faint glow of embers. The Plantation mansion, once the proud symbol of my father's wealth and authority, burned behind me. Its roof sagged, blackened beams groaned, and walls cracked under the relentless fire. I stood outside, the cold morning air sharp against my wet, soot-streaked skin. The world smelled of ash, charred wood, and rain-dampened earth, a smell that carried both the sting of destruction and the strange relief of release. Through the haze I saw them, the 5 men who had dared to stand against decades of oppression. They walked slowly away from the ruin, their backs straight, silhouettes etched against the misty tree line. The smoke curled around them, softening their edges, yet their presence remained powerful and commanding. They were finally free, moving through the fog like ghosts of the past, now turned agents of justice. I wanted to call to them, to reach out, but the weight of the moment held me silent. The mansion's collapse felt almost ceremonial. Each beam that fell, each wall that tumbled, was a punctuation mark to the life that had been forced upon us. For years, my father had ruled with iron authority, his wealth and brutality unquestioned. But in these final hours, the fortress of oppression crumbled before the storm we had wrought, not with weapons but with courage, unity, and a long-suppressed insistence on justice. I inhaled sharply, letting the smoky air fill my lungs. My eyes traced the path of the men disappearing into the fog, their torches long extinguished, leaving only the faint glow of dawn to mark their passage. A strange calm settled over me. It was quiet, almost unnatural, the kind of calm that follows a violent storm. Not the storm of fire itself, but the storm of emotions, fear, planning, and defiance that had raged in our hearts for weeks. The ground was littered with ashes, fragments of furniture, and shattered glass. I stepped carefully, each footfall crunching softly against the remnants of what had once been the seat of power. The air shimmered in waves of heat and dampness, and I felt a mix of sorrow and vindication. It was a complicated feeling, seeing a life's work, however cruelly built, dissolve into ruin, while also knowing that the ruin symbolized justice finally served. I thought of the whispers behind the stables, the nights of plotting under the oak trees, and the solemn promises we had made in secrecy. Every quiet meeting, every shared glance of understanding, every act of courage had led to this. The mansion's destruction was not the end of our journey, but a pivotal marker, the tangible evidence that tyranny, no matter how entrenched, could be dismantled. Smoke drifted lazily into the sky, mingling with the morning mist, creating a sepia-toned world that mirrored the images in my memory. The darkened rooms, the glances shared in candlelight, the flashes of lightning through broken windows. The destruction was cinematic, almost symbolic, yet profoundly real. I could almost hear the walls whispering, echoing the years of suffering and control that had taken place within them. I sank to the ground, letting the ash sift through my fingers. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to grieve, not for the mansion, but for the life we had been forced to live under its shadow. Every memory of fear, pain, and restraint washed over me, tempered by the strange satisfaction of justice realized. The men had reclaimed their freedom. In a way, I had too. As the smoke rolled across the horizon and the mansion continued to burn, I felt a sense of closure. The dynasty that had once loomed over us with fear and authority was reduced to nothing more than embers in the morning fog. And yet amid the ruins, there was life, quiet, persistent, and hopeful. Birds began their tentative songs in the trees, and wildflowers pushed their way through the ashes, hinting at a new beginning. I stood again, brushing the ash from my dress. My eyes lingered one last time on the figures retreating into the mist, their journey toward freedom just beginning. The mansion was gone, but the lessons of courage, solidarity, and moral strength remained. They would carry us forward, into a world where oppression could no longer claim dominion over our spirits. For the first time in years, I felt unshackled. Not by chains, but by the weight of fear lifted, by the triumph of justice, and by the quiet promise of life beyond the ruins. And as the smoke drifted upward, mingling with the dawn light, I knew that the ashes of the dynasty would nourish the seeds of a new life, one defined not by power or cruelty, but by courage, resilience, and hope. The morning mist hung thick over the ruined plantation, wrapping the landscape in a soft, haunting shroud. The fire was long extinguished, leaving only charred remnants of the mansion scattered across the grounds. I walked slowly toward the large magnolia tree at the edge of the property, its branches heavy with dew and early sunlight filtering through the leaves. Each step felt solemn, weighted by the years of sorrow, fear, and secrecy that had led me here. In my hands, I carried a small wooden box, the last vestige of the life my family had once possessed. Its edges were worn, and its surface dusted with ash, but within it lay the private fragments of a dynasty now gone. Letters, trinkets, and documents that, though powerless against the lives they had damaged, represented the memory of what had been. I sank to my knees beneath the magnolia, letting the morning chill seep through my dress, and gently began to bury the box in the damp earth. As I worked, I allowed myself to reflect on all that had passed. The mansion that had loomed over us like a fortress of tyranny, the nights of plotting in shadowed corners, the quiet glances and whispered agreements, the lives touched by fear and courage alike. Every choice, every risk, had led to this final act of closure. I pressed the soil firmly over the box, ensuring it was hidden yet secure, as though sealing away not just physical objects, but the weight of a past now ended. The mist swirled around me, rising and falling like spirits in the soft morning light. I could hear the distant rustle of leaves and the faint sound of the 5 men walking away into the fog, their path toward freedom irreversible. Though I would never see them again in the same way, their presence lingered, an invisible support that steadied me as I completed this final act. The world felt quiet, almost reverent, as if it too recognized the significance of this moment. I leaned back against the magnolia tree, its broad trunk solid and grounding beneath my shoulders. The branches stretched overhead, their leaves shimmering with dew, and I felt a strange sense of comfort and permanence. Life persisted here, in the quiet, in the mist, and in the soil that would reclaim what had once been torn from it. The wildflowers beginning to bloom around the base of the tree were small, delicate reminders that new growth often arises from the ashes of what was lost. In that stillness, I contemplated what it meant to be the last heir, not the heir to wealth or titles or authority, but the heir to memory, to lessons learned, to the consequences of cruelty and the power of resistance. I understood, more than ever, that legacy was not measured by possessions or social standing, but by the choices we make, the courage we summon, and the truths we preserve for those who come after. The box was buried, the fire was out, and the mist began to lift, revealing the first clear light of day. I felt a weight lifting from my chest, a sense of finality tempered by hope. Though I had witnessed the collapse of a dynasty built on fear and exploitation, I now faced a future unshackled by the past. The plantation grounds were silent, yet filled with possibility, a quiet testament to endurance, renewal, and the resilience of the human spirit. I stood slowly, brushing my hands against my dress, and took in the scene around me. The magnolia tree remained steadfast, the fog gradually dissipating, and wildflowers dotted the ground in bursts of soft color against the gray and blackened remnants of the mansion. Every detail, from the twisted remains of the burned structure to the delicate petals brushing against my feet, told a story of endings and beginnings intertwined. In that moment, I realized that being the last heir carried responsibility, not to the fallen dynasty, but to the life and world we were reclaiming from its ruins. I whispered a silent farewell to the past, feeling a final connection severed yet honored. My future was now mine alone, to navigate with courage, wisdom, and hope. As the sun rose higher, piercing the dissipating mist with golden light, I allowed myself a deep cleansing breath. The soil under my fingers, the towering magnolia, and the subtle bloom of life around me symbolized the continuity of existence, the triumph of persistence, and the promise of new chapters waiting to be written. For the first time since the ordeal began, I felt calm, resolute, and free. The ashes of the old life had settled, and from them something enduring and life-affirming emerged. I walked slowly from the magnolia tree, carrying with me the lessons, memories, and courage that would guide me forward. Though the dynasty was gone, its lessons would remain, not as chains, but as beacons lighting the path toward a future defined by resilience, justice, and hope.